Hello everyone, I am Halcyon and today I'll be reviewing the most anticipated title in gaming history. Hear that? I'm building anticipation. The game I'm talking about is of course Cyberpunk 2077, which I enjoyed a lot despite its many problems. But that's only because I'm a veteran of 100 early access games and I have learned a long time ago to keep my expectations low. I was hoping it would be at least half as good as people were hyping it up to be, but we didn't even get that.
Tisk, tisk, tisk.
There's no sugarcoating things. The launch of this game was an unmitigated disaster which could be summed up in a single phrase by none other than Boris Pugac-Murashkevich.
Investors pulled their funding, leaving most establishments unfinished. It's one of those places where expectations and reality collided, resulting in a heap of disappointment.
What an awesome voice, what a terrible prophecy. But this game ultimately accomplishes what it sets out to do, even though it falls short in delivering on all of the promises that were made, and as far as I'm concerned, both the harsh critics and the rose-tinted goggles-wearing fanboys fail to paint a clear picture, so let me give you my unbiased opinion, because it's the only one that matters. So let's see, is there anything worth our time in this buggy mess? Before we start, here's a brief overview. Cyberpunk 2077 is a first-person dating sim which includes, but is not limited to, decent RPG elements, broken police mechanics, a rich, branching storyline, a severe lack of open-world AI, compelling characters, and acceptable action sequences. All this being part and parcel of what is, in my opinion, the most beautiful city I've ever laid my eyes on. You know, when it renders properly. Now you may notice that every positive thing I say is quickly followed by a negative. That is because people nowadays, myself included, have very short attention spans, and if I go for too long talking about the good stuff, some may wrongly assume that I'm praising this game. As much as I would like to do that, I can't. So let's break Cyberpunk down into multiple parts, analyze each of them with our Kiroshi scanners, and then put the whole thing together to see how it truly holds up. Let's begin with the main attraction of this game. Welcome to Night City. We have bright neon lights, overly sexualized advertisements, luxurious mega buildings, trash bags everywhere and people dismembering each other on every street corner, all under the watchful eye of our benevolent corporate masters. This is truly the peak of human civilization. And if that's not enough to convince you, come on down to Jig Jig Street and you're sure to find something you'll like. Words cannot begin to describe the beauty of Night City, and neither can my 5-year-old computer, which struggles to render the environment 10 meters in front of me, but even on low settings, I find myself spacing out from the gameplay and just taking in the sights, occasionally grabbing a picture with a photo mode. My only source of grief when it comes to this aspect is that I couldn't afford an RTX 3070 before they went out of stock. And while we're still talking about the beauty of this environment, it goes beyond the visual because the developers did something that's not often done in video games, at least not to this extent. World building through music. All but a few of the songs that play on the radio stations were made specifically for this game, and cruising through Night City while listening to music about Night City is a truly magical experience. Until the song gets brutally interrupted by a news report urging people to tune into the live-streamed public execution of a convicted murderer.
The execution will be open to the public, and for those who prefer to watch from home, it will be live-streamed at the address you see at the bottom of the screen.
Surprisingly, the murder rate per capita sits only at a mere 142, which is only slightly higher than the most murderous city in our current timeline. At least until you enter the scene and start stacking more bodies in a single week than all the corpse, gangs and cyber psychos can scrape together in an entire calendar year. Although if you think about it, that will decrease the murder rate, because you're only allowed to kill criminal scum. But if you wanted to play this game as if it were Grand Theft Auto, I have bad news for you, because the very second you inappropriately touch a civilian, the police spawns right behind you, and if you exercise your Second Amendment against the boys in blue, even more of them will make use of their instant teleportation devices to spawn where the sun don't shine and pump you full of lead. With such an omniscient, omnipresent and omnipotent police force, the only conclusion we can draw is that crime exists only because the higher-ups want it to exist. That doesn't apply to you though. If you drive your Honda Civic into a crowd of people to atone for your ketamine abuse, run, and hide from the police until your wanted level clears, because if you don't, MaxTech will show up and put a bullet in your skull and there's nothing you can do about it. Basically, if you try to play in the sandbox, you'll be disappointed because the sand has been heated to several thousand degrees and has turned into glass, and if you even gently tap on the glass, it will shatter into a million pieces and you'll end up in the hospital with multiple lacerations. At least that's how some people describe their experience with this game, because unlike Grand Theft or Red Dead, you're not free to rob stores or live out your Ted Bundy fantasies. To put it simply, there is no open world interaction. Civilians are governed by dumb AI and only have one reaction to violence. If you try to talk to them, they have but a few lines of dialogue that sometimes go in direct contradiction to each other.
My, what a sweet little face you have. Kiss my dead spunk!
There are almost no random encounters, and despite what was promised back in 2018, your actions don't influence the game's world or change the relations with certain factions, like in Fallout New Vegas. Does any of that bother me? Not really, but at the same time, the developers shouldn't have made promises they couldn't keep.
I think we got rid of it. Random encounters like these are an example of how your actions directly influence your open world experience.
Now let's go back to that phrase from the beginning. This game ultimately accomplishes what it sets out to do. What's that mean? It means that CD Projekt Red hasn't created Grand Theft Cyber Auto because the intricacies of such a game are only known to the rocker boys at Rockstar Games. Instead, CDPR have done what they know best: The Witcher, but in a cyberpunk setting. Similarly to their previous games, Cyberpunk is focused on telling engaging stories. Similarly to their previous games, the Great Wide World serves only as a space to be navigated in between quests, and similarly to their previous games, you do not play a custom character that can be whoever you want him to be. Sure, you can customize your face, body, and schlong size, but ultimately, just like Geralt, V is a predefined character who has his own personality, problems, and ambitions. You get to choose how those ambitions are accomplished, but that's about it. And when I started to view this game as Witcher with guns instead of futuristic GTA, my whole perspective changed. No longer do I run around the world looking for an authentic sandbox experience because I'm never going to find it. Instead, I sank my teeth into the meat of this game, sticking to the main quest and side jobs, and meeting interesting people who need the services of a professional mercenary such as myself. Celebrities, politicians, the friends you make during the main quest, and even Flaming Crotchman are but a few of the memorable characters that will get you caught in the tangle of their lives. And if you wish to engage in some great storytelling, that's exactly what this game was aiming to deliver. Since this is a spoiler-free review, I shall do my best to avoid specifics, so I will stick to describing the narrative structure instead. A quote endlessly hammered into our minds by Mike Pondsmith is,
"Cyberpunk isn't about saving humanity, it's about saving yourself."
And he's been saying that for at least 8 years, if not longer. And I did not listen. I had my own set of assumptions for how the story would unfold. Similarly to The Outer Worlds, I was expecting that the main story would involve an anti-corporate rebellion, where my character would either join the anarchists and burn the entire system to the ground, or work my way up the corporate ladder at Militech and eventually, with Meredith Stout by my side, rule this entire city with an iron fist from a position of ultimate power. After destroying Arasaka, of course. But my expectations were subverted because as you do the big job that's supposed to set you up for life, things take a turn for the worse and you find yourself having to abandon all of your plans as you're forced to fight for survival. Ironically reflecting my own personal experience as a content creator who tries to cover this game. The narrative of Cyberpunk 2077 is not about changing the world or joining in its subjugation. It's about surviving in it. This game delivers a very personal story with a lot of emotional moments that are going to be appreciated by anyone who still has a soul. Unlike those corporate fucks at Arasaka, my only complaint with it is its rather linear structure, which may seem to contradict my opening statement, in which I described this game as having a branching storyline. Well, here's what I meant. The main story is pretty much linear, with minor variations which we'll ignore for the sake of saving time. That is the tree trunk. But during the main quest, you will meet certain characters that help you along your journey, and at some point, these same characters may contact you again as they need your help. As far as the main quest is concerned, your deal with them is done, and you can feel free to ignore their requests. But if you don't ignore them, These side jobs have their own stories that branch out of the main narrative. And if you got really close to the person you're helping, their branches may unlock different endings which you would never have experienced if you just stuck to the main quest. A thing that no self-respecting RPG player has ever done in his life. When you hear it coming from me, that may not sound like much, but when it's put in front of you, the story and the characters and the wonderful moments you spend in this game are a thing of beauty, I know, which will never fade away from your memory if you're anything like me. Why am I torturing my viewers with my singing? Subjectively speaking, the story of Cyberpunk 2077 is among the most beautiful I have ever seen in all my years of gaming, especially when you don't detach the side jobs from the main quest. I'm pretty sure the developers weren't planning to separate the two, but the casual crowd was complaining that The Witcher 3 was too long. And because the casuals are where the big money is, these missions were moved into the category of optional content which could easily be skipped, such as River Ward's entire storyline, which is entirely detached from the main quest, but may have its own ending if you meet the requirements. To be honest, I'm sick and tired of games being dumbed down for the casual crowd, but that is a subject for another time. But just like the rest of this game, the story has some glaring issues that I doubt will be fixed with patches, and I can't just ignore them. Let's first address this game's replayability, since it was one of its main selling points. Unlike in The Witcher 3, most of the choices you make during your playthrough have no effect on how the story develops. Some of the side jobs you embark on and a few dialogue options may unlock different endings, but that's about it. At the end of my playthrough, I was free to choose whichever finale I wanted. Even the one that directly contradicted everything else my character stood for. In stark contrast, you could not choose your ending in The Witcher 3, because it would unfold based on the choices you took throughout your campaign. As an example, spoiler for The Witcher 3 ahead, if you chose to forcefully shove Dijkstra out of your way, he would abandon the plot to assassinate King Radovid, and that would lead to the genocide of all sorcerers and non-humans. Cyberpunk does not have such consequences for any of the actions you've taken. Sure, some people might die as an indirect result of your actions, and some of the people you've saved or spared may come to your aid during certain endings, but other than that, the story doesn't change too much. The only replayability I can see for this game is in the playstyles. Maybe you finished the game as a guns-blazing super soldier, and you would like to play again as a stealthy netrunner or as a pacifist. But in terms of story-changing choices, the game falls short, and I am a bit disappointed. Another thing that rustled my jimmies towards the end of my campaign was the way important quests were made available. So I cleared the map of all side jobs, and before wrapping things up and proceeding past the point of no return, I was like, stop! There's some moments from the trailers that I haven't experienced. So I let 24 in-game hours pass, and then I got a call from this character to continue with their mission, and I walked over there, and lo and behold, I had to wait for another day because the mission was scripted to start at 5 PM, but I arrived there at 6 PM, and once that mission was done, I had to wait another 24 hours for the next part in this storyline and for the next call. And then walking over there, waiting for the character to arrive, finishing the quest, waiting another day for the next call, and going over there and waiting some more. And if you know how the main story goes, you can probably figure out why waiting makes no goddamn sense in this context. I understand that people have their own lives and may not always want to hang out with me, but from a gameplay perspective, this is bad pacing. I've also been bothered by the false sense of urgency instilled upon me throughout the main quest. Phone call after phone call after phone call with the same message. Be there immediately.
Do not make me wait.
And because I suffer from side quest syndrome, of course it took me dozens of hours to get there. And when I saw the people who called me just patiently waiting, twiddling their thumbs, and then acting like I didn't just spend an entire week avoiding them, feels rather unnatural. One more thing that makes it difficult to do side jobs is the fact that they're marked with this symbol on the map. That's not the problem. The problem is that car offers and cyberpsycho sightings, which are supposed to have their own map markers, use the very same icon, so it's a bit of a chore to sweep through all of these markers to find the side jobs with an actual story. But the map can be fixed with just a simple patch, so I'm not gonna hate on it too much. Other than those, the map is also filled with all manner of activities. First, there's blue markers, which usually indicate ongoing crimes to which the omnipresent and omnipotent police department doesn't bother responding, so it's up to you to head over there, neutralize the perpetrators and steal the evidence, and their loot. Here you can sometimes find large piles of eddies, decent gear and even legendary cyberware that costs an arm and a leg. Or both arms in this case. There's also gigs, which are all about go there, do that, get paid, which have some short backstory to them but are mostly irrelevant to the main story. But they are there to give you some extracurricular activities so that you may put your newly acquired cybernetics to the test. In these quests you can decide whether you want to follow the instructions to the letter and do them all according to their exact specifications, but even the stealth missions don't force that playstyle upon you. If you want to be a ghost who gets in, completes the objective and gets out without a trace, you can do that and you'll get a small bonus. But if you want to just chuck a million grenades and blow the whole place to smithereens, the only punishment you'll get is a scolding from your fixer. These open world activities may be meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but at least they happen consistently. If you feel like putting your weapons to use, there's a fight waiting for you on every street corner. If you want, you can spend 5 hours back to back doing nothing but fighting, but if you'd rather go on some story mission and engage in dialogue, you're free to do that. To be entirely honest, I enjoy this system of checklist gaming a lot more than the open world from Red Dead Redemption, where I would walk around endlessly before 5 O'Driscolls decided to ambush me. Or having to wait hours on end for a train to spawn so I can go rob it and make that some money. Don't get me wrong, the devs at Rockstar are geniuses when it comes to creating a living, breathing open world, but outside of rampages and fighting the police, there's not a whole lot of meaningful open world activities in their games. And their stories are linear and the mission design inflexible, but I'm not here to criticize those games. But even so, I would have liked for these gigs and hustles to be discovered through exploration, instead of littering the map like it's an Ubisoft game. Well, at the very least we don't have to purchase microtransactions to skip the endless grind. Speaking of, yeah, this game can get grindy, if you allow it. But for me, what you call grind is just a fun hour of shooting maelstromers in their ocular implants. My legs. And yeah, I said it. Shooting is fun, as is the rest of the combat in this game. It's not perfect, and we'll get into that in a second, but it is good enough. First, there's the gunplay, which despite not being as realistic as Tarkov or Siege, is still enjoyable. There's plenty of weapons to choose, from tech sniper rifles that pierce walls, to smart SMGs that fire homing micro-missiles which independently track enemies hiding behind cover. If I were a weapons merchant in Night City, my slogan would be, a tool for every occasion. Most people criticizing the gunplay in this game give the impression that all the weapons are a reskinned version of this toy pistol, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Weapons feel weighty and impactful, a fact that also reflects on how enemies ragdoll around when they eat a buckshot breakfast. I'm also a fan of the reload animations, as each weapon has at least 4 of those and they all look and feel nice, and as a bonus, every time you equip a new gun, your character will inspect and admire it. I only wish we had a special button for these animations so we can play them whenever we want. Other complaints I've heard regarding this subject is that you cannot reload while sprinting, or that your character feels weak, or that enemies are bullet sponges, but the same people who say that this isn't a proper RPG refuse to pay attention to the skill system and invest into perks that would solve all of their problems. I do have my own complaint about gunplay. Some of the guns sound kind of weak, especially the Ajax assault rifle when you don't use full auto. Moving on to the melee combat, again, it's nothing spectacular but it feels good enough. And having played a melee-focused character for over 80 hours, I can confirm that it's pretty damn fun to jump around, chimp out and pummel people with my gorilla arms. There's also a little detail I like. If you punch somebody hard enough to throw him into a wall, he takes damage from both impacts. But feeding goons your knuckle sandwich isn't all you'll do, because there's a variety of melee weapons available to you, both lethal and non-lethal. Sledgehammers, katanas, and even a workforce motivator hidden inside of your arms. Some of these weapons even have unique executions which look pretty good, but they quickly get old since each weapon only has 1 or 2 such animations. Also, the melee combat doesn't just consist of spamming light attacks, because if that's all you'll do against a competent melee opponent, you're gonna lose. In order to win the toughest of fights, you'll need to know when to use heavy attacks, fast strikes, parries, blocks, shoves, and dodges, otherwise you'll be dead in the water. There's only one problem I noticed. Sometimes when I execute a perfect parry, I still take damage even though I shouldn't. I'm pretty sure this is a bug and not a feature. All in all, I am satisfied by the melee combat as well, although I think it could have been done a lot better. All this, however, will become obsolete as you level up, because even on the highest difficulty, enemies drop like flies. True, they deal a lot of damage and they can delete you in a couple of shots, but even so, most fights feel way too easy at higher levels. I would have preferred more challenging fights that required players to prepare before every encounter and be more tactical in their approach, as it was in The Witcher 3. I still remember the contract for hunting down a vampire, how I drank a potion of black blood to poison the sucker when it bites, preparing regeneration potions for myself when I was inevitably going to get wounded, equipping moon dust bombs to prevent the monster from making its escape, and rubbing vampire oil on Arendite, my silver sword. All that had to be supplemented by quite a bit of skill on my part as I timed my dodges and parries and used the right combination of magic signs to maximize my survival. In Cyberpunk you can finish all fights with a rusty knife if you so desire, which detracts from the challenge. To summarize, I would say that the combat in this game is enjoyable, but at the same time it's a far cry from what I was expecting to see in an RPG, which is a shame because there's quite a decent amount of RPG elements as far as character development goes, which allows for some interesting builds. First you have attributes, skills and perks which can be combined however you wish, and that is supplemented by a layer of cybernetics that can further enhance your playstyle. Apparel may also contribute to your character build, but only later throughout the game when you get your hands on legendary armor pieces and good mods. The primary purpose of clothing at lower levels is to make your character look good. Function comes second. I've heard some people complain that their characters look like clowns because they equip whatever has more armor than the piece of clothing they want. And let me tell you right now, that is a mistake. First of all, if you want stats, you don't pick by amount of armor provided by the item. You pick by amount of mod slots, so you can stack the Armadillo mod, if you want armor, or some of the other clothing mods that exist in the game. Word of warning: if you obtain an expensive mod such as Fortuna, and you're unable to craft it yourself, do not, under any circumstance, waste that mod in any armor you wouldn't wear. I suggest you wait until you find a legendary piece of clothing with 3 or 4 mod slots, and if it fits your style, then you can install whichever mods you want. I personally wear whatever I fancy and fill the mod slots with armadillos that I craft every few levels to keep up my armor stat. But I think I should keep my tips and tricks for my guides instead of cramming them into this review. So, character progression and customization is decent, but far from perfect. Unless you heavily invest into the tech attribute, you won't be able to wear whatever you want and have it be useful at the same time. At least not early on. To make things worse, the fashion shops of Night City rarely stock legendary clothing. Even rarer it is to find a legendary that you think would look good on your character and fit your style. Another criticism I have of the state of clothing stores is that they're inconsistent and unintuitive. If I go to Avant, I should find elegant corporate suits, and Jinguji should sell the most exquisite neo-kitsch clothes. But no, those stores sell ballistic vests, torn shirts and other pieces of scheisse worn by the lower class. I wish each clothing store had its own theme, and stocked at least a few pieces of legendary clothing that would fit that theme. And since I've started bitching about various aspects, let's continue the flood of criticism for this game. I won't bother talking about the bugs and the glitches because number 1, every game has them at launch, albeit not quite in this volume, and number 2, everybody else is talking about them, so let's actually discuss what is unequivocally the biggest blunder in this game. The lack of open world interaction with the inhabitants of Night City. Now, some people were probably hoping that each and every pedestrian would have his own unique backstory, dialogue and romance options, but let's be honest. That's whoops, sorry. I was about to say a bad word. That's unrealistic. But even so, if CDPR wanted to bring us
to the next generation of open-world adventure,
perhaps they should have taken some inspiration from GTA in making their pedestrians act in a more interesting manner.
You are dead meat! I want to apologize.
Moments like those aren't an absolute requirement for an open world game, but if Cyberpunk had them, it would have been on another level, because as things stand, pedestrians are nothing more than decorations whose sole purpose is making the world not feel empty, which isn't much different from how they were in The Witcher 3. That doesn't bother me in the slightest, but at the very least, crowds should act more realistically when you accidentally discharge the entire magazine of your LMG through them, instead of disappearing as if they were all Batman or doing whatever this is.
You don't want to fuck with me?
But random acts of violence in the streets of Night City do not make sense for someone like V, who just like Geralt, is a predefined character whose primary goal is becoming the most famous mercenary in this city. According to the World Compendium, reputation is everything, and a rampage against unarmed pedestrians isn't the hallmark of a competent mercenary who gets the job done. It's simply a random cyber psycho attack that people will quickly forget about once Max Stack deals with a situation. Which brings me to the next point. Instead of a broken wanted system that tries emulating that of GTA and miserably fails, Cyberpunk should have taken inspiration from the Assassin's Creed games and display a message similar to the one you get in Valhalla, but with a lore-friendly twist on it. Kill one civvy and you get the message, cyberpsychosis symptoms detected. Kill another, cyberpsychosis imminent. And when you kill a third, you get a game over screen that says your mind was lost to cyberpsychosis, and we can safely assume that your character blacked out, went on a rampage, and eventually got put down by Max Stack. Cyberpsychosis was an important role-playing element in the original pen and paper game, so that's one way it could have been implemented in 2077, and it would have had the same end result as the overpowered police, with none of the programming effort and, most importantly, no bugs for people to complain about. Think about it like this. Half the missions in GTA, if not more, involve you fighting the police and making your escape, and such a system made sense in those games. But in Cyberpunk, not even the missions that have you fighting the NCPD activate the wanted system, so what the hell is its purpose? Just to be a meme? If the multiplayer adds criminal elements to the players, sure, go ahead and make the police system work, otherwise just scrap it. Add it to the list of cut content because as things stand, this system is entirely useless. Moving on. The next gameplay issue that's probably never gonna get solved is this game's difficulty. As I've said, even on very hard, once you get some decent weapons, cybernetics and skills, the game feels too easy. Enemies die quickly, and as a countermeasure, they're able to kill you very quickly, even if you're decked out with the best gear known to man. Don't get me wrong, I'm still having a lot of fun with the combat, but as I've said, to me it feels more similar to a shooter like Far Cry than a proper RPG that would force players to be more tactical. I do have a few suggestions for improving combat, but they would require multiple systems to be reworked. First and foremost, guns should no longer apply status effects like fire and electricity, at least not in the way they do now. As an example, the Fenrir SMG deals very low damage per shot, but it has a high chance to set enemies on fire, and a single burst of flames can deal more damage than 100 bullets. I don't know about you, but when I give someone a lead injection, setting him on fire is the last thing I expect. What I would do instead if I were a game designer is remove the status effect chance from regular guns and introduce specialized weapons. A Flammenwerfer or a plasma pistol to set my enemies ablaze, a poison dart gun or a neurotoxin-loaded Panzerschreck for chemical damage, and all tech weapons should be reworked into dealing electric damage instead of physical. As for melee weapons and cyberware, being able to switch their damage type with mods is already pretty good. Now that we've established guns to only deal physical damage and also introduced specialized weapons, enemies should have beefed up resistances against various damage types. Make robots immune to fire and chemicals, heavily resistant to physical damage, but vulnerable to electric. Humans with few augmentations should be more resistant to EMP damage, and based on the description of the Contagion quick hack, Maelstromers should be heavily resistant to everything but chemical and electric damage types. I could go on, but each faction should have its own strengths and weaknesses. Hell, the animals don't even use electronic cyberware, so they should be immune to quick hacks, EMP, and chemical damage. But factions aren't the only way combatants are separated into different categories, because there's plenty of enemy types that already provide a solid foundation for a proper RPG combat system. There's bruisers, ninjas, snipers, shotgunners, assaulters, and netrunners at least. They all bring something unique to the table, but unique doesn't matter much when they can kill you in one shot, and you can do the same to them. So here's a couple more suggestions. First of all, buff netrunners. Right now, all they do is sit in a corner and occasionally upload the overheat demon to my systems once per minute. What if they would do more? Primarily, they should provide an extra layer of ice to their comrades and make them harder to hack, by increasing demon upload time and RAM requirements for players. Secondly, they should have more demons in their arsenal. Reboot optics should temporarily blind us, weapon glitch should jam our weapons for a few seconds and force us to switch, or hell, high-level netrunners should have access to the self-deletion demon that would give players a 30-second countdown to hunt down the netrunner, or flatline themselves. Ideally, each enemy type should pose a different kind of threat and have his own strengths and weaknesses to force us to do more than just open fire and hope for the best. Bruisers, for example, should be huge bullet sponges unless hit in the head. Assaulters should be extremely aggressive and never stop firing. And shotgunners should use their Sandevistan to flank us behind cover. That behavior is already there, all the devs need to do is buff it a little. I would have also loved it if named characters that were sent to assassinate during gun for hire gigs were actual boss fights, or at least mini-bosses with unique movesets and beefed up resistances. Every Witcher contract I've done provided me with a unique monster encounter, so CDPR should have taken a page from their own book and applied it to Cyberpunk. It is a bit underwhelming for bosses like Jotaro Shobo or Gustavo Orta to be regular enemies that can be downed in just a couple of hits. But this video is long enough as it is, so let's move on to the next bit of criticism. Night City changes everybody. Now that was a freaking lie. Except for my forearms, nothing has changed, despite the fact that I jammed an implant into every orifice. I can't even get a haircut anywhere in the city, let alone personalize V with aesthetic cyberware. Character customization past its creation is simply non-existent, and even though it didn't break my gaming experience, it still felt misleading. This will have to change if they want to add multiplayer. And if customization is coming, I suggest an extra cyberware slot into various sections of the body that is reserved for just fashion wear. Another area where CDPR dropped the ball was in driving AI. Parking your bike in the middle of a busy street is enough to stall traffic for an entire day because the NPCs can't be bothered to drive around it. There is some driving AI, but it could easily be studied under the field of cryptozoology, that's how rare it is. Or maybe people are just scared to steer left or right, seeing how driving feels like ice skating with two left feet. The open world is also slightly disappointing. For example, Pacifica was advertised to be a war zone that would endanger your life, but I can just go there at level 5 for a leisurely stroll and no harm will befall me as long as I don't approach the combat zones. I can't help but feel that this is a missing feature that couldn't make it in the final game because the production was rushed. You know what else feels rushed? The looting and crafting system. In The Witcher 3 I had to find schematics, farm materials, and order an armorsmith to craft me a badass set of armor. In Cyberpunk, if you don't have the skills to do it yourself, that's too bad. I would have no issues with crafting being locked behind a skill I can develop, but in this game, the crafting economy is entirely broken. You can scrap soda cans into spare parts, turn those spare parts into fully functioning sniper rifles, and then disassemble those rifles for even more materials than you initially used to craft them. Then, once your crafting skill develops and you have thousands of spare parts that you've materialized out of thin air, you can combine them into higher tier spare parts to craft legendary weapons and clothing, and sell the surplus for millions of eddies. Looting and dismantling junk to craft it into useful items was one of my favorite things to do in Fallout 4 because in that game it all made sense. In this game, however, all of your weapons, armor, inhaler and grenades can be made from soda cans, and for me, that just ruins the immersion to the point of making me ignore the crafting system altogether outside of crafting bullets and armor mods. Another thing that Fallout did right and Cyberpunk doesn't is in making medicine precious. Stimpaks were scarce on the survival difficulty and I usually reserved those for intense fights. Max stock inhalers on the other hand, you can spam that shit all day and still have hundreds left, especially if you loot everything all the time. Looting in this game also feels more like a chore than a reward, although I won't go in depth talking about all the issues. And since we're still comparing it with Fallout 4, there is one thing Cyberpunk does better in this regard. If you want to use bullet time, you don't need to go into your inventory to pop a jet. Simply install the Kolesnikov system and dodge while aiming, or activate the Sandevistan OS. But there is one more thing that should have been in the game, and I actually lied about a little when I jokingly called Cyberpunk 2077 a dating sim. Because while there's a few interesting romance choices, you can't do much with these characters outside their designated quests. No calling them to your apartment or going out in town and having little chats with them, or taking them on as a companion to blast some scavs together like any healthy couple does. None of that. You just do their missions, choose the romantic dialogue options and enjoy what little you're given. I don't particularly mind this, since I usually find romance in video games to be more of a gimmick, but I think we can all agree that little moments like the ones I suggested would have done wonders for this game, especially when we take into account how well written and acted these characters are. This makes me miss the endless calls I got from Roman. Now, what else is there to complain about? The fact that you can't even run Cyberpunk on last-gen consoles, even though that's the sole reason it was delayed a third time? Not really my area of expertise since I play on PC. The low frame rate? That's on me because I didn't have money to upgrade my computer in time for this game. See, I'm taking responsibility for this. Just like how CDPR should have taken responsibility and said that the PS4 and the Cyberpunk themed Xbox cannot run this game. Yet. Sure, they would have lost a sizable percentage of Christmas sales revenue, but in the long run, it wouldn't have been such a blow to their reputation. Anyway, there's no denying it. CDPR fucked up, and there's a long road ahead for Cyberpunk to be the game that was promised. But if they listen to their community and implement some of their suggestions, and they are dedicated enough to pull off a No Man's Sky redemption arc, I see great things ahead for this game. Last but not least, I wanted to compare some of Cyberpunk's elements to other games before I schlep it with my final rating. Let's start with the combat gameplay. Many people, including one of my close friends, said that the enemies are bullet sponges. That is partially true if you fight enemies that are several levels above you, or you didn't invest any perks into the skills related to the weapons you're using. But if you put your points into assault, your rifles will wipe everybody out in a few shots, even on the hardest difficulty, provided they're not several levels above you. In comparison, the legendary difficulty of Skyrim still gives me nightmares. I was fully spec'd into the one-handed skills with all the perks that would increase the damage I deal by dual wielding, and enemies would refuse to die. True, the enemies in Skyrim weren't bullet sponges because there were no firearms during the Viking Age, but my point stands. Because Cyberpunk wanted to be like GTA, let's compare its open world to Los Santos. Yeah, CDPR are little children compared to Rockstar in this department, but Cyberpunk's mission design is still better than Red Dead Redemption 2. Does that mean that RDR is a shittier game than 2077? No, but that's how some people draw their conclusions when they criticize a game based on a single aspect, instead of taking a look at the whole picture. If you judge a dog based on its ability to climb a tree, you will consider that dog to be stupid. What about a reputation system? Night City is filled with gangs, megacorps and independent factions, all vying for a piece of the pie, but unlike in Fallout New Vegas, none of that has any effect on you. You can stack a million 6th Street corpses on top of each other and they will never start sending hit squads after you. And similarly, doing that won't make the Valentinos accept you as their personal lord and savior. I don't see how such a system could be implemented in the current iteration of this game, but the trailers hinted at this possibility and the devs should have reined in their marketing team before they started promising features that could never be delivered. Finally, I've heard some people voice complaints that Cyberpunk 2077 is not a true RPG. When compared to The Witcher 3, it does not have the same amount of plot-changing choices, but it still has more choices, both in the story and the character progression, than Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is one of my favorite RPGs of all time. There's many more comparisons to be made with other iconic games, but my point stands. In some aspects, Cyberpunk does a better job than them, but in many other areas it falls short. And that's not only because of the bugs, but because of the rushed production. Perhaps this game could have been the second coming that was hyped for all this time, if the developers stuck to their original release date. But alas, the fans and the investors and the executives were getting impatient and the game was shipped before it was ready. And now many people want CDPR financially crippled under a torrent of lawsuits because the game wasn't perfect in every regard. Ultimately, the version of Cyberpunk 2077 I played was a functional game that I greatly enjoyed spending 200 hours in, despite its many core gameplay issues and technical problems. That is because, unlike the people who were expecting this game to be a perfect life simulator that would replace all social interaction for an entire year, I kept my hype levels in check and expected nothing more than another piece of entertainment with an interesting story, endearing characters, and fun gameplay. And that's exactly what I got. I'm not going to lie, I would have liked this game to be better, and I was hoping CDPR would live up to the hype they created and deliver an even better game than The Witcher 3. It's a crying shame they couldn't. What I hope for them in the future is that they'll treat Cyberpunk as an early access release, because that's exactly what it is, fix the major issues, improve the performance, and if it isn't too much to ask, add features that should have been there on day one. Maybe even rework a few gameplay elements like the crafting system or open world combat encounters and give us some more interesting mini-boss fights. Anyway, it's difficult to give this game a final rating without first explaining the concept called suspension of disbelief. In literature, it is mandatory for you to abandon all logic and reason if you are to enjoy a good book. Why didn't Harry Potter just shoot Voldemort with a Colt 1911? Why didn't the Eagles fly Frodo to Mount Doom? How do the White Walkers animate a pile of skeletons that have no muscle tissue to hold them together? When you start asking questions and poking holes in the picture the author was trying to paint for you, every single story fails. In gaming, suspension of disbelief extends to the act of looking away from the bugs and the glitches and poorly executed mechanics in order for you to enjoy the game you spent $60 on. Even if sometimes the bugs won't ignore you, but if you are able to apply that concept and enjoy Cyberpunk the way the developers were intending, in my opinion, this game is a solid 8 out of 10 underneath all that grime. But that is not its final rating as much as I would want it to be. Because we've analyzed most, if not all, of this game's aspects, let's rate them all independently and then calculate the average score. The story gets an 8 out of 10. Beautiful and engaging, but lacking meaningful choices. The characters get a 9 out of 10. They lost a point because sometimes the jolly system for facial animations doesn't work and keeps their mouths shut while they speak.
Specific sensations.
The gameplay is a 7 out of 10 because while it's fun, it's too dumbed down for an RPG. The open world, while beautiful as a painting, is as interactive as one, so with a broken heart, I give it a 2 out of 10. The technical side of this game is also a 2 out of 10. I mean, bugs and glitches are to be expected in such a huge open world game, but they're a bit overwhelming in this title, even when I turn on my suspension of disbelief. The performance is acceptable on my PC, but overall it gets a 3 out of 10 because it failed to run as advertised on last-gen consoles. The graphics and the world design have a 9 out of 10. Subjectively, I'd rate it lower, since my computer is rather weak, but I've seen how Cyberpunk looks on higher-end systems, and it's simply a gorgeous game. Moving on to the sound design and the ambience, I'd rate it as an 8 out of 10. The music, on the other hand, gets a perfect 10 out of 10 score. Well done, lads! And the final piece of the puzzle is the overall impression Cyberpunk left on the gaming community. As a game, it isn't that bad, but compared to what was promised by the hype machine, the final product is a 2 out of 10. And if we calculate the final tally, it comes up to a nice and round 6 out of 10, which isn't bad for an early access game that is judged as if it were a full AAA release. Oh, it was a AAA release that cost 60 goddamn eddies. I personally don't regret spending that amount of money for this game, but even if you like story-based RPGs, which many people don't, I suggest you wait for a sale before you spend your money on this game. That point would have been more relevant if this review wasn't released a month after the game's launch. But unlike many other content creators, I did not receive pre-release access. It pains me to have given this game such a low score, but it is unacceptable for AAA publishers to release unfinished games and promise to fix them after the fact. All we can do now is hope that CDPR intends to honor that promise and polish Cyberpunk into a game that makes us all proud to have stood by its side through these dark days, and when that happens, I'll be there to review it again and give it a higher score. I can't wait for it. But in spite of the low rating, I enjoyed the 200 hours I spent playing this game, and I plan on spending at least 100 more, and I shall do so on this channel via live streaming and a video series that I've been planning since 2018. You can feel free to join me, or not. You can also feel free to give this video a like supreme if you appreciate this type of content. But for now, I've said everything I had to say, and we are done. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.